The air was supposed to smell like flowers that day. Instead, it carried whispers, sharp, judgmental, slicing through the joy we had tried to build. I watched their faces as they scanned every detail, the folded chairs, the simple white arch, the buffet we had poured our savings into. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes said not good enough. I wanted to scream that love doesn't need chandeliers or gold-plated forks. But I stayed quiet, holding my daughter's hand as she stood in her dress, radiant, nervous, full of hope. And that's when I realized this wasn't just their disrespect. This was a line they had crossed. And I was about to cross mine. Lydia had spent months planning this wedding with her fiancé, Ethan. Every detail reflected them sweet, simple, meaningful. We hosted it in our backyard, string lights crisscrossing the garden, wildflowers lining the aisle, a small stage for their vows. Lydia had dreamed of a wedding that felt like home. Ethan's parents, however, had a different vision. They came from money, the kind that whispered instead of shouted. From the moment they arrived, their eyes did more talking than their mouths. Mrs. Holloway glanced at the chairs, pursed her lips, and whispered something to her husband. He nodded slowly, like he'd just seen a child's messy drawing framed in an art gallery. I tried to ignore it. This day was for Lydia and Ethan, not for them. But every sideways glance, every forced smile, every sigh pressed harder against my chest. When the ceremony began, Lydia's voice trembled as she read her vows. Ethan wiped away a tear. The crowd clapped softly. It was beautiful, raw, imperfect, real. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught Mrs. Holloway rolling her eyes at the wooden arch behind them. I clenched my jaw. During the reception, things only got worse. Mrs. Holloway pulled Ethan aside. I couldn't hear everything, but her words were sharp. "This is so quaint. I just expected more." Ethan looked uncomfortable. Lydia noticed too. I walked over, forcing a smile. "Everything all right?" I asked. Mrs. Holloway smiled the way people smile when they want to look kind but feel superior. "Oh, everything's fine. I suppose this is charming in its own way." My stomach twisted. Charming wasn't a compliment. It was a dismissal dressed up nicely. Then came the moment that burned into my memory. Lydia and Ethan were about to cut the cake. Everyone gathered around, phones up, smiles wide. Just as they lifted the knife together, I heard Mr. Holloway's voice behind me. Honestly, with all the money they spent on that dress, you'd think they could have afforded a proper venue. The knife paused midair. Lydia's smile faltered. Ethan's eyes darted nervously toward his parents. And in that silence, something in me snapped. The next morning, the backyard still smelled faintly of flowers and burnt candles. Folding chairs were stacked in uneven rows, empty champagne glasses scattered across tables like forgotten applause. Lydia sat at the kitchen counter in her robe, her hair loose, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. "They hated it," she whispered. I set down the dish towel slowly. "Who?" She didn't have to answer. Ethan walked in a moment later, his tie loose around his neck, looking like someone who'd just woken up from a storm instead of a wedding night. He avoided my eyes as he kissed Lydia's forehead. "They just expected something different," he said carefully. "You know how my parents are." Lydia laughed without humor. "Different? Or better?" He didn't reply. I watched her shoulders slump. The glow that had surrounded her yesterday was gone, replaced by something duller, like light through dirty glass. I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, hot and steady. I wanted to protect her, but I also knew this wasn't my moment to speak. Later that afternoon, Ethan's parents invited us all for brunch at their house. Lydia hesitated, but Ethan insisted it would smooth things over. Their house looked like something out of a luxury magazine. Marble floors, high ceilings, vases that probably cost more than my car. A house where silence echoed. Mrs. Holloway greeted us with that same polished smile. "Well, yesterday was certainly memorable." Lydia squeezed my hand under the table. As we sat down, they began talking about the wedding like it had been some cute charity event rather than their own son's ceremony. "The arch was interesting," Mrs. Holloway said delicately. "And the food, well, very home style," her husband added. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Lydia's face flushed red. I forced a polite smile. It was exactly what Lydia wanted. Mrs. Holloway tilted her head. Of course, of course. I just thought, for Ethan, perhaps something a bit more elegant would have been fitting. You know, appearances matter in our circles. There it was. Not even sugar-coated anymore. Lydia's voice cracked slightly. It wasn't about appearances. It was about us. Mr. Holloway chuckled softly, the kind of laugh people give when they think you don't understand the world as well as they do. By the time we got home, Lydia was shaking. She slammed the door behind her, pacing the living room like a caged bird. I spent months making it perfect, she said. Every flower, every light, every detail, and it still wasn't enough for them. Ethan stood by the doorway, silent. Say something, she begged. He rubbed the back of his neck. I can't control what they say. They're just like that. She stared at him, tears brimming. So you're okay with them tearing it apart? With them tearing me apart? He didn't answer quickly enough. That silence was louder than any insult. That night, I lay in bed replaying every moment, the whispers, the glances, the brunch. My blood boiled. They hadn't just disrespected a wedding. They disrespected my daughter, my family, everything we'd poured into that day. And beneath the anger, a thought began to form. A quiet, sharp thought. If they couldn't appreciate the love we gave, why should we honor theirs? I didn't know it then, but that thought would become the spark that changed everything. A week after the wedding, Lydia and I were sitting in the living room folding leftover decorations when Ethan walked in holding a stack of cream-colored envelopes. His expression was tense, like he knew what was coming wasn't going to sit well. My parents are hosting a reception, he said carefully. Lydia froze mid-fold. A what? A formal reception, he continued, avoiding her eyes. They said some of their friends couldn't make it to the wedding, so they want to celebrate with a proper event at the country club. My chest tightened. Country club. Proper event. It wasn't a reception. It was a redo. Lydia slowly set the decoration down. So, basically, they're throwing their version of our wedding? They just want to celebrate, Ethan said quickly. It's their way of making it up, I think. She stared at him like she didn't recognize him. Making it up? Or rewriting it? The next day, an official invitation arrived at our house. Thick, expensive paper. Gold embossed lettering. It read like something out of a high society magazine. The Holloway family requests the honor of your presence at a grand reception for Lydia and Ethan, hosted at Willow Creek Country Club. There wasn't a trace of the original backyard wedding. No mention of the ceremony. No photos. Just their name, bold and elegant, front and center. Lydia held the card like it was burning her fingers. They're pretending like our wedding didn't even happen. I took the card gently from her hands and read it again. The anger I'd felt that night came rushing back, thicker this time. This wasn't just disrespect. It was erasure. Ethan's parents called later that evening to discuss details. Mrs. Holloway's voice was smooth, practiced. We're thinking black tie, she said. A string quartet. A proper dinner. Oh, and Lydia, dear, we should probably consider a new gown for the evening. Something more fitting. Lydia's jaw tightened. My gown was perfect. Of course, sweetheart, Mrs. Holloway cooed, but this is a different kind of event. We want you to look the part. I could hear Mr. Holloway in the background, murmuring about seating charts and guest lists, names Lydia didn't even know. Lydia ended the call abruptly, tears streaming down her face. It's like they're ashamed of everything we did. I sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They don't get to rewrite your story, I said softly. She leaned against me, exhausted. But Ethan keeps saying they mean well. He doesn't see it. And that's when I realized the battle wasn't just with his parents anymore. It was between two worlds, colliding under my daughter's name. The weeks leading up to the reception were suffocating. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. Mrs. Holloway would send swatches of fabric, links to expensive decorators, notes about proper etiquette. Lydia tried to push back, but Ethan always ended up playing peacemaker, smoothing over his parents' demands instead of defending his wife. At dinner one night, Lydia slammed her fork down. Why are we letting them control everything? Ethan sighed. Because it's important to them. They just want to celebrate us in their way. Lydia's voice cracked. then why does it feel like it's not about us anymore? I watched quietly, my hands clenched under the table. I'd promised myself not to interfere, but watching my daughter shrink under their expectations was like watching someone dim the lights in her soul. That quiet thought from before returned, sharper now. If they didn't respect her, maybe they didn't deserve to be celebrated by us. But instead of reacting impulsively, I waited. Listened. Observed. Because sometimes, silence builds the kind of strength anger can't. By the time the night of their grand reception approached, Lydia looked tired, not in the way brides do after planning, but in the way people do when their joy has been taken from them piece by piece. She stood in front of the mirror, trying on the gown Mrs. Holloway had suggested. It was beautiful, but it wasn't her. She turned to me slowly. Mom, I don't even recognize myself anymore. I met her eyes in the mirror. Then maybe it's time someone reminded them who you are. The night of the Holloway's grand reception arrived like a storm I'd seen coming but couldn't stop. The country club was glowing, chandeliers, marble floors, gold-trimmed everything. Valets opened car doors with practiced bows, guests in tuxedos and evening gowns floated toward the ballroom like they belonged to another world. Lydia stepped out of the car slowly, her hand trembling in mine. She looked stunning, of course, but it wasn't her. The dress, the heavy jewelry, the sleek bun, it all belonged to someone else's fantasy. Not my daughter's. You ready? I asked softly. She took a shaky breath. I guess I have to be. Inside, the ballroom was a spectacle. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Crystal glasses sparkled under the lights. Waiters moved like shadows, balancing trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked too delicate to eat. And everywhere, people whispered, "There she is, the bride. She's lovely. Such a shame about the first wedding." I heard it was backyard. How quaint. Each word sliced through the air, small but sharp. Lydia heard them too. I could tell by the way her shoulders tensed a little more each time. Ethan was busy greeting guests, laughing nervously, trying to play both sides. Mrs. Holloway floated toward us, draped in pearls, her smile wide and rehearsed. "Oh, Lydia, you look absolutely radiant," she purred. "Doesn't she, everyone?" A group of her friends nodded, offering polite compliments that didn't reach their eyes. Mrs. Holloway leaned closer to Lydia. "Now remember, dear, when we make our entrance, smile. These are important people." Lydia nodded silently. I stood back, biting my tongue. Every instinct in me screamed to grab my daughter and walk out. But I didn't. Not yet. The reception began with speeches. Mr. Holloway stood on stage, microphone in hand, giving a carefully polished toast about family legacy and celebrating in style. He barely mentioned Lydia's name. Then Mrs. Holloway took the mic. "When we envisioned this day," she began, "we knew it had to reflect the grace and elegance that our families represent. Tonight isn't just a celebration of love, it's a celebration of standards." The audience clinked their glasses approvingly. Lydia's eyes widened. She glanced at Ethan, who gave her a weak, apologetic smile. My blood boiled. Standards. As if love needed to pass their inspection. Later, as dinner was served, I overheard two older women whispering at the next table. "It's good they decided to do something proper after that backyard thing." "Oh, absolutely. I mean, bless her heart, but some people just don't get real weddings." Lydia pretended not to hear. She picked at her food quietly, her face pale under the chandelier light. I leaned closer to her. "You okay?" She gave a small nod. "Just trying to get through it." I reached for her hand under the table. She squeezed mine back. That small moment, silent but strong, was the only thing holding me together. Then came the breaking point. During the couple's dance, Mrs. Holloway insisted on announcing them with a flourish. She called Lydia and Ethan to the center of the ballroom. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and all eyes turned toward them. Ethan led Lydia out, but as they began to dance, Mrs. Holloway whispered loudly to her friend at the edge of the floor. "At least this one looks like a real wedding." The friend laughed. A few others joined in, like hyenas circling their prey. Lydia heard it. I saw it happen the moment the light in her eyes flickered. Her smile faltered, her steps stumbled. Ethan tried to steady her, but she shook her head, whispering something through clenched teeth. I rose from my chair slowly, hands gripping the edge of the table. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it in my ears. Enough. The song ended. Applause filled the room, hollow and cold. Lydia stepped off the dance floor, heading toward the exit. I followed her, catching up just as she reached the hallway. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling, "I can't do this anymore." I cupped her face gently. "Then don't. You don't owe them anything." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Ethan doesn't get it. He thinks they're just trying." I looked back through the ballroom doors. Mrs. Holloway was laughing with her guests like a queen in her court. A quiet resolve settled in my chest. If they thought they could humiliate my daughter to elevate themselves, they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about a reception anymore. This was about dignity. And I was done watching quietly. I stood in that hallway with Lydia's trembling hands in mine, and for the first time all night, my fear was gone. The humiliation, the whispers, the fake smiles, they had built a wall around us. But now, that wall had cracks. And I was ready to break it. "Stay here," I whispered. Her eyes widened. "Mom, what are you going to do?" Something I should have done a long time ago. I turned and walked back toward the glowing ballroom doors. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses grew louder with every step. My heartbeat matched the rhythm of my heels against the marble floor. Inside, the Holloways were toasting again. Mrs. Holloway stood at the microphone, her pearls catching the light like armor. "To love," she declared, "and to the kind of celebration every couple deserves." The crowd raised their glasses. I walked straight toward the stage. People turned, curious. Mrs. Holloway noticed me approaching, her smile faltering for just a second. "Oh," she said into the mic, "Lydia's mother is joining us." "How lovely." She started to hand me the microphone, expecting some polite thank you. She didn't get that. I took the mic and stood center stage. My hands were steady. My voice calm. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, I began, my eyes scanning the crowd. But after everything that's been said, maybe it's time someone does. A ripple went through the guests. Mrs. Holloway stiffened behind me. 2 weeks ago, I continued, my daughter married the love of her life in our backyard. Under string lights we hung ourselves, surrounded by people who loved them. It was beautiful, heartfelt, and real. I paused. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. But tonight, it feels like some of you are pretending that day didn't happen. Like love only matters if it's dressed up in chandeliers and country clubs. Murmurs began. Mrs. Holloway forced a smile, whispering something to Mr. Holloway. I turned to face her directly. "You've made it very clear what your standards are. But let me make something clear in return. My daughter's wedding was good enough. More than good enough. Because it was hers." The silence was heavy now. Real. I scanned the crowd again. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others watched intently, as if waiting to see if someone else would speak up. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage. You know what's funny? People act like money can buy class. But what I've seen tonight is a room full of people who've mistaken show for substance. A sharp gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Holloway's face tightened. I softened my tone then, not out of weakness, but because truth doesn't need to scream. Love doesn't need validation from gold-plated forks or marble floors. It lives in laughter, in tears, in the way two people hold hands when the world gets loud. And if you couldn't see that at their wedding, maybe the problem isn't the wedding. For a second, the room froze. Then, like a spark catching, a few guests started to clap. Quietly at first, then louder. It wasn't everyone. But it was enough. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, trying to take back control. "That's quite a speech," she said with forced sweetness. "But this is our event. Perhaps it's best to keep things." I turned to her, meeting her gaze head-on. "No. This is Lydia and Ethan's marriage. And you don't get to rewrite it." The crowd's attention snapped between us like they were watching a live drama unfold. Mrs. Holloway opened her mouth, but for once, no words came out. Ethan finally stepped forward, his face pale. "Mom," he said softly. "She's right." The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Mrs. Holloway stared at him in disbelief. "Ethan," he shook his head. You can't keep treating Lydia like she's a guest at her own life. This has to stop. Lydia appeared at the back of the ballroom then, her tear-streaked face lit by the golden light. When she saw Ethan standing up to his mother, something shifted in her eyes. She walked forward slowly, joining him at the foot of the stage. I handed the mic to her. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling but strong. I've tried so hard to fit into this version of love you've created, she said, looking at the Holloways. But I can't keep shrinking to make space for your expectations. This is my life. My marriage. And it's going to look like me. The room erupted, some clapping, some whispering, some stunned into silence. Mrs. Holloway looked around, suddenly realizing the control she'd wielded so effortlessly was slipping through her fingers. And I stood there on that stage, my heart pounding, knowing there was no going back now. The moment the applause started, something shifted in the air. The ballroom didn't feel like their kingdom anymore. It felt neutral, like the ground between us had finally leveled. Mrs. Holloway's smile had vanished. Her pearl necklace didn't look like armor anymore. It looked heavy. She stepped toward Ethan, her voice sharp but quiet enough to sound controlled. You're embarrassing yourself, she hissed. Ethan didn't flinch this time. No, he said firmly. I've been embarrassing myself by letting this go on. Her eyes widened. It was as if she couldn't process that her son, the one who always smoothed things over, was finally drawing a line. Mr. Holloway moved closer, his expression tense. This isn't the place for theatrics, he muttered. Ethan shook his head. No, this is exactly the place. Because this is where it all started. You tried to turn our marriage into a performance, and we let you. But it ends tonight. The whispers grew louder now. Guests exchanged looks. Some nodded approvingly. Others were scandalized, clutching their champagne glasses like the drama was too much for their perfectly manicured world. Lydia stepped closer to Ethan, sliding her hand into his. She didn't need to say anything. The simple gesture spoke volumes. For the first time that night, Mrs. Holloway looked small. Not because anyone yelled at her, but because the power she held was built on everyone else staying silent. And silence had finally broken. She straightened her posture. If this is how you want to embarrass our family, then perhaps we should reconsider. Ethan cut her off gently but firmly. Mom, this is my family now. Lydia and me. Not your guest list. Not your image. Us. The room exhaled collectively, like everyone had been holding their breath. I watched from the stage, a strange mix of pride and heartbreak swelling in my chest. Pride because my daughter finally stood her ground. Heartbreak because it took this much pain to get here. Mrs. Holloway turned abruptly and walked toward the exit. A few of her friends followed, their heels clicking like tiny hammers against the marble floor. Mr. Holloway gave one last disappointed glance before following her. Half the ballroom watched them leave. The other half started to clap again. Not out of pity, out of respect. Later that night, after most of the guests had gone, the ballroom was quiet. The string quartet had packed up, the lights had dimmed, and all that remained were a few scattered candles still burning low. Lydia and Ethan sat on the stage, their shoes off, their heads resting against each other. I stood a few feet away, watching them in the soft glow. I'm sorry it turned into this, Ethan said softly. Lydia shook her head. No, I'm glad it did. Because for the first time, it felt real. He reached for her hand. I should have stood up sooner. She smiled faintly. You did when it mattered. I walked toward them and sat down beside them on the stage. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Like the storm had passed, even if the cleanup was still ahead. Ethan glanced at me nervously. Your speech was incredible. My mom's never been challenged like that before. I smiled, a little tired but warm. It wasn't about challenging her. It was about protecting you both from being rewritten. Lydia leaned her head on my shoulder. You've always done that. I wrapped an arm around her. Always will. The ride home that night was quiet, but it wasn't awkward. Lydia stared out the window, her makeup smudged, her dress slightly wrinkled, but she'd never looked more like herself. I thought tonight would destroy me, she whispered. I looked at her through the rearview mirror. No, sweetheart. It rebuilt you. She smiled faintly, like she was tasting the truth in those words for the first time. The next few days were tense. The Holloways didn't call. Ethan received a few clipped texts from his mother, words like disappointed, ungrateful, and public spectacle thrown like darts. But he didn't cave. He replied once, "We're happy. That's what matters." And for the first time since the engagement, Lydia didn't shrink at the thought of his parents. She stood taller, spoke with certainty. The wedding might have been simple. The reception might have been a battle. But their marriage? That was theirs now. Completely. And that quiet victory was worth every second. A few weeks passed after that night. The world didn't end, though it felt like something in our lives had cracked wide open. In reality, something had finally aligned. Lydia and Ethan had settled back into their small apartment on the edge of town. Gone were the endless debates over centerpieces, seating charts, and expectations. Instead, their evenings were filled with quiet dinners, laughter over burnt lasagna, and late-night walks in the chilly autumn air. The storm had passed, but its lessons lingered. One Saturday morning, I visited them. Lydia opened the door barefoot, hair tied messily, face glowing in the soft morning light. She wasn't wearing layers of makeup or forced smiles. She looked like herself again. "Coffee?" she asked, holding up a chipped mug like it was a trophy. I stepped inside and looked around. The apartment was cluttered but warm. Photos from the backyard wedding covered one wall, fairy lights twinkling behind Lydia in her dress, Ethan laughing mid-dance, me wiping a tear behind my sunglasses. None of it looked staged. It looked alive. Ethan joined us at the kitchen table. He looked lighter too, like a weight had finally lifted off his shoulders. "My parents still aren't talking to us much," he admitted. "But honestly, it's quieter without all the noise." Lydia reached over and squeezed his hand. "We're okay," she said softly. I smiled. "More than okay. You two finally stopped performing for everyone else." Ethan nodded. "I spent so long trying to keep the peace that I forgot what peace even felt like." We all laughed, not the nervous kind that had filled so many of those nights, but the easy, genuine kind. Later that afternoon, Lydia suggested something unexpected. "Let's go to the backyard," she said. "Your backyard?" I asked. She nodded. "Yeah, I want to go back." We drove to the house. The fairy lights were still hanging along the fence, slightly weathered now. The arch from the wedding leaned against the tree, its paint chipping in places, but still standing tall. Lydia walked to the center of the grass and stood where she had said her vows. She looked around slowly, taking it all in. "This," she whispered, "was real. This is where it all started." Ethan slipped his arm around her. "And this is where it stayed ours." I watched them from the porch, my heart swelling. That day of the wedding had felt like the happiest moment of my life. But this quiet moment weeks later, it felt deeper. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about owning what was always theirs. Lydia turned to me suddenly. "Mom, you know what's funny?" "What?" "I used to think their approval was everything. That if his parents didn't like me, it meant something was wrong with me." She shook her head, smiling softly. "But standing here now, I don't need it." Ethan kissed her forehead. "Neither do I." That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, we sat on the porch with mugs of hot chocolate, wrapped in blankets. The air smelled like leaves and distant barbecues. Somewhere in the neighborhood, kids were laughing. Lydia leaned her head on my shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For standing up for me. For us." I looked at her, my heart full. "You were always strong, sweetheart." I just reminded the world of it. A few days later, a letter arrived from Mrs. Holloway. Lydia opened it cautiously, expecting venom. But instead, it was clipped, polite, almost humble. She wrote that she regretted how things unfolded, that perhaps she let expectations cloud the joy, and that she hoped for a chance to rebuild. It wasn't a full apology, but it was a start. Lydia folded the letter and tucked it away. "We'll see," she said calmly. "No bitterness. No fear. Just strength." Months later, they hosted a small dinner at their apartment, friends, close family, laughter echoing off the walls. There were no chandeliers, no string quartets, no country clubs. Just warmth, stories, burnt garlic bread, and love. As I watched Lydia and Ethan dancing barefoot in their tiny living room, fairy lights draped over the curtain rods, I realized something. Their story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about outshining anyone. It was about refusing to let someone else define what love should look like. And that, more than anything, was the happily ever after they deserved.